in a way that's fair is very interesting and tricky. What do you guys think would be an example of an unfair schedule?
Always give it to Mark.
Always give it to Mark. Okay? Now, Mark might think that's fair. All right? But would the rest of the processes think that's fair?
No.
The first in, last out stat is a great dispute.
Well, but why?
Why is it unfair?
Yeah, why is it unfair?
The first one in doesn't get touched until everything else is going.
Yeah, but why would that be unfair? Eventually gets run, right?
But eventually it could be once.
Okay, you're on the right track. You're like,
There's no guarantee it'll ever get to the bottom.
there's no guarantee that it ever gets to the bottom. What problem do we have?
Starvation.
Starvation. Now, what's happened here, you started to go through Zach, is that it may be a long time before a process gets scheduled. And there's nothing wrong with that in our definition of fair. Because we're going to have a very low bar on fair. And all we're going to say is there's no starvation. Sound like a low bar? All it has to do is run that job mere milliseconds before the expanding sun captures our planet and destroys it. It'll be slower than the bogons. But as long as we get it run before then, we don't have starvation.
How can you tell when something's about to expire?
I can't hear you.
How can you tell when something's about to starve?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's like, how do we know we're being fair? How do we know it's Mark's process? Okay, how about all these different things? Okay, turns out that we're going to have to put some ideas into our scheduler. The scheduler has to make decisions. Okay. Now, the goal here is to make efficient use of our processor. So we're going to start off in an environment that is very, very simple, very easy to tell if we're being fair, and on first glance is absolutely useless. But it turns out it's not. It turns out these types of environments used to exist commonly. Now they exist, less commonly, but more special. Oh, so what we'll be taking a look at is things from a historical perspective, but all the algorithms we're going to look at for the next 2 class meetings are still in use today because of special needs for special computing environment. Okay. There's dozens more algorithms are out there. We're not going to study one. Okay. There's a decent one in the book we're not going to study either called lottery scheduling. Although if you guys just really want to know how to fairly run a scheduler in the presence of chance, we can certainly go into it. It's essentially a research scheduler. We're hoping eventually it's going to become more mainstream.
That's a fancy one.
But it's kind of cool. It's kind of like saying that if you keep buying tickets, you'll eventually win a lottery. Okay? Kind of an interesting way of looking at things. So, one of the things that I want to point out is that scheduling a process is different from the scheduling process. Okay, how many people just went, you lost me, it's still before noon. Okay. So what happens is the overall scheduling process has everything to do with putting jobs into the CPU, taking them out of the CPU, and managing the core of our state diagram. Remember that the original state diagram you just had those three states? Okay, that we can argue very cleanly is the scheduling process. We're only going to talk though this week about that arc that went from the runnable process to the running state. That's all we're going to talk about. We're not going to talk about descheduling. We're not going to talk about being blocked on an I/O event or any of that. We're not going to talk about exit. We're going to talk about the algorithms for that one arc. Okay? It's surprisingly difficult. So we're going to sneak up on it. We're going to start talk about very early computing environments, and these still exist today as specialty systems, especially embedded systems. And eventually we're going to work up to what is a modern Unix, Linux, Windows type system that we expect to use during our career. Okay. There's some challenges as we go along the way. And we're going to see something really, really cool. And we'll try to stop and appreciate some of these. One of them in particular, we're going to stop and just thank the hardware gods that exist. But we're going to see that in order to have more capability for our operating system and scheduler, it turns out the hardware environment had to evolve. And we're not going to talk about it, but the hardware environment couldn't evolve until the materials market evolved. And then we had to have the ability to produce accurately smaller and smaller structures. Whereas now, we have structures inside of our chips that are well under 1 nanometer in width. Okay. There will be systems soon on the market, we're hoping, that exist in some very, very high-end research systems. But there will wind up being eventually what we call traces, the little metal lines we ship electrons down. They'll be 1 molecule wide. There are current systems that are being the techniques are being used on a very small scale that are 3 molecules wide. Think about this now. You could look at a chip after it's been manufactured, and most of the lines you can't see without an electron microscope. Does that sound funky? Has anyone ever seen a picture of a package that's been shaved off a chip so you can actually see the die? Okay. As soon as we get down to several molecules wide, currently when you look at a chip, in that state, you look at it, and the areas that are dark, it's like, well, they couldn't put anything there for manufacturing reasons, but they're very close now, where it'll pretty much all look dark, and that's just because the structures are so small. Kind of weird. Okay. So, back in the very, 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 very old days, when computers first started out, does anyone know what we made our circuits out of? Wire. About 14 gauge wire. All right. About the thickness of a lead pencil. Not your mechanical pencil, but a pencil that you have to sharpen. About the thickness of a lead. That was considered a very small wire. Okay. Now, most of that was because it was both convenient and cheap. A lot of this development occurred in wartime scenarios. But also, you could make wire thinner, but actually be able to use it in the manufacture of computers, the building, back then it was all done by hand, was tricky. Okay? Because it turns out that having the wrong 2 wires touch each other creates a little problem called a short. Has anyone ever shorted anything in their house or anything like that? Just had that little puff of smoke curl up from your brand new plasma TV? No, nobody's done that? So, and who knew they carried a little thing of smoke inside the power supplies as a signal when something went wrong? It's like setting up a flare. Look, we need service.
That
Okay.
is pretty.
So, we're talking about the scheduling process, okay? But we're going to talk about it from the standpoint of scheduling, or giving a process to the CPU. Now, I put in this comment, has anyone ever heard of the series Red Dwarf? And there's a link to Talkie the Toaster. The intelligent evolved toaster. Now, scheduling a process, that mechanism is very simple. It answers one and only one question. Which process gets the CPU next? That's all it does. No matter how advanced it is, that's all it does. Okay? That's it. And we're going to spend 2 days talking about it. Right? So, who gets the CPU next? Which process? Turns out that that's surprisingly difficult. All right? Because what we'd like to do is the next process to get into the system, into the CPU, we want one that's going to make the best use of the CPU, right? How does the scheduler know what a process is doing? Because it kind of has to be omniscient, doesn't it? You say, hey, which process is most deserving to get into the CPU next? Which one's going to make the best use of it? Or which pool, even which group is going to make the best use of it? And this is because we're trying to predict what? The future or the past? How many of you have ever tried to predict the past? Every Monday morning for all the guys, right? How many of you predicted yesterday's game? No. So, we're trying to predict the future. And if you pay attention to the stock market, you know that's tricky. Except, we're going to try to predict the future, and we're going to do a pretty good job of it. We're going to do a pretty good job of it. It's not going to be perfect. We're going to do a pretty good job. Part of that is because the way we're going to continue to constrain our environment. There's things we know about our environment that restricts how our environment can be used, and we're going to get pretty darn good CPU utilization out of it. We're not going to talk about all the different pieces, but we're going to talk about the scheduling algorithm and how evolving that is going to help us. Now, in order to help us do this, we're going to have two simple metrics. The more metrics you have, and all metrics is a measurement, okay, some standard. Like one of the metrics you'll see on some systems is percent CPU utilization. Okay, we're not going to go for something as fancy as that. We're going to talk about two numbers that just have to do with time. Okay, but it turns out that by focusing on one or the other, we can represent different job types. And that's really where we're going to constrain this environment, is we're going to try to do it around job type. We're going to find out that job type is a very, very difficult concept until we get to something both flexible and complex. Then we have to decide if it was worth it to go through all that complexity. Okay? So the metrics we're going to use are turnaround time and response time. So turnaround time is going to be from when a job enters the system to when it's done and leaves the system. Okay? So you come in, you put a job on the system, and its turnaround time is when it finally says, I'm done running. Okay? Everything is done. We're going to have what we call response time. And response time is weird. Okay? It's really weird. Notice that it's the time for when we first run a process minus its time of arrival. So that is the delay or latency from when it arrives in the system to the first time it gets the CPU. Okay. Not every time it gets the CPU. The first time it gets the CPU. And that one's kind of weird. And we'll see why this is a good formula on Wednesday. Because we're going to talk about what we mean by first arrival. When it first arrives. I mean first run, not first arrival. First run. We're going to talk about what this means. And by manipulating the definition slightly, we're going to have a very, very good definition of response time. Okay? Now, how many of you are looking at this going like, well, that Mark, that's a stupid calculation. Okay? You should. You should. So what I want you to do now, you want to be my process? I'll be the CPU.
Yes, sir.
All right. So you're going to arrive in the system, and as soon as you arrive in the system, just say, "I'm here." That's it.
I'm here.
There's your CPU. Okay. Good. Time slice is over. I'm going to take it back. Did he have good response time? By that definition, the fact that I put it over here and never pick it up again, does he still have good response time? Oh, yes, he does. Because when you first arrived in the system, you got the CPU real fast, didn't you? And then you never got it again. But by this definition, that's good response time. Okay? You see, you kind of look at that. Now you're kind of looking up there going like, okay, I want to know what kind of snake oil you're trying to sell me, Mark. Because you just demonstrated that this is a useless metric. It turns out, though, that it all comes down to what we mean by the term first run. All right, what we mean by first run. And first run, we say when a job arrives in the system, it's time until its first run. What does it mean for a job to arrive in the system? Okay. Once we start drilling down on some of these ideas, it turns out that we can make different assumptions. And under those different assumptions, we can get different performance out of different algorithms. And so we're going to start off by ignoring response time. Okay? And that's because we're going to start off with talking about some schedulers that work in primarily what we call a batch environment. Turnaround time, which is just the amount of time it takes for a job to run from the time it arrives in the system to the time it leaves the system. Okay. That's a really good metric for what are called CPU-bound jobs. Jobs that primarily just use the CPU.
So just to clarify, the turnaround time is not when you start the program to when you finish it. It's just when it gets the CPU to
When it first arrives in the system. So, for example, let's say your program arrives in the system, but it doesn't get the CPU for 10 hours. That 10 hours is part of the turnaround time.
Yeah.
Okay. So you see that it's if it was when it first gets the CPU when it gets out, that's sort of an optimal metric.
Right.
But if you have delay for getting in, that's still part of your turnaround time. Okay. So yeah, so if you arrive very early, then the latency that you wait until you get the CPU is part of your turnaround time. Okay. This arrival is the same arrival when you first arrive in the system. Okay. If you have a long delay on getting into the CPU, then you have poor response time, right?
First run again?
First run is just going to be your job arrives in the system the very, very first time it gets the CPU.